Is anything changing in our lives? This is the most frequently asked question in history. As a historian who also teaches history, it has always been a challenge for me to make history practical. This is true not only history, but also for all humanities. And for this purpose, I always looked for tools to reach this goal. And one of the tools is the concept of historical thinking and history teaching, change and continuity. Very simple words. But this concept, along with other concepts of historical thinking, have been developed, especially in Canada and Netherlands, and our goal is to implement in Armenian historical context also. So, do we understand change and continuity not only on the surface, but in essence? Or are people able to study and implement different skills to detect and study changes and continuities in our societies and in our environments? I remember one of my childhood case which made me think about change and continuity. It was 1989, 2 years before the collapse of USSR. There were different movements, in movement of independence and Artsakh movement who were joining in the squares of Yerevan. And once I remember one of our teachers slapping a student for wearing a red pioneer tie incorrectly. A few months later, at the same time, in 1989, I remember that our school went on strike, and the other schools, maybe almost all schools of Yerevan did the same. And I noticed a very interesting moment in my life. I noticed a student who just took off his red tie, the same pioneer tie, and starting to clean his shoes. Then I saw that all the students of the school did the same, and myself also. So the teacher, who just a few months later just beat and slapped a student for wearing a tie, just passed by without any attention on students who were just cleaning their shoes with the red tie of the symbol of communism. So what happened with the student? What happened with the teacher just after a few months, after a few hours, when a few months ago they were under the strong pressure of 70-year communism propaganda? So this question is very interesting to understand two different times and what has changed and what is continuing in our lives. Such childhood memories, I have always think about such childhood memories, and the main question remains again, what is changing and what is going on in our societies, in our environments, in us? So I can bring some examples of circumstances when we think about changes and continuities. One of the examples is how we compare different times. So this is the main approach, how to develop for students skills to study change and continuity in essence. And I can bring different angles by which history becomes more contextual. One of the perspectives is political perspective. Another is cultural perspective. Another is religious perspective. And I can bring some examples how we compare different times from the point of view of all these angles. I remember for some people in the times of COVID-19, for them, there was a perception that it happens, this pandemic happens in the world for the first time. But when we just compared another case of pandemic of 13th and 14th centuries, the Black Death, and we just compared it from different angles, and we revealed similarities and differences, there was a sense to understand what has changed and what is continuing, that it is not happening for the first time in the world. Another perspective is to compare different times from the point of view of education. What we do sometimes. An example is to bring two miniatures of different types of universities of Armenia. One is Zohrab Gevorgyan of 13th century, and another is Tatev Hamalsaran from 15th century. And we compare it from different angles, details by details, and understand what is changing in education, in the classroom, and understand different trends which are coming from the past in educational sphere. Another example is comparison of times based on women, changes of women's social and legal status in the society. And it gives students different methodology and skills to look on the history from different angles, to understand all colors of history. So you see here, one is the painting of Jan Vernier, the girl with pearl earrings, and another, the painting of 18th century famous Armenian painter Jacob Hovnatanyan, with again pearl, with a woman with pearl. So differences between different times, the social status of women, gives us sense how is changing the role of women in society. Another example is to compare different times from the perspective of two great transformations in human history. One is the transformation from paper, from parchment to paper, when people in medieval ages started to use paper, gradually to use paper instead of gold and parchment. This is a very interesting question because it happened in medieval times and it lasted from 7th century up to 16th century and until now, by the way. When paper technology was spread from China to Middle East and Europe, and this was a huge psychological challenge for people to trust more paper than to gold. But when we compare the same time where we live, when we follow the same situation, the same transformation, when we follow the transformation from paper to digital world. Because today we live in the same psychological challenges when we have to be adapted in the new reality, when we have to trust not a material, but a digital one. So this kind of perspectives give students a broader context of history, and they understand changes comparing two different times, which will be differences in centuries, in decades, in 10 years, in 19th century, in 20th century, from different perspectives. So what happens when the main question, what is changing and what is going on in our societies, in us, is not sufficiently circulated and studied in educational environments of societies? As a result, a fatalistic approach and attitude toward time increases. And sometimes, every point of the time becomes similar. It means that time, every point of the time becomes similar, it seems, in the societies. There will be different expressions like history repeats or whatever we do, nothing will change. And life becomes not a dynamic process, but a process like a movement of squirrel rotating in the round circle. So like a squirrel, when squirrel doesn't notice changes and continuations, life becomes something like a line, and another question comes with the same great question of history: what's next? Because history is not about time. History is not about past. History is not about present, but history is about really time. Because every trend which are coming from the past, continuing in the present and future. So what's next is the greatest question of history. Thank you.